Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be exploring one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, humanoids. I find this subject endlessly fascinating. There are so many cases. This episode is called From the Stars, 12 Astounding Extraterrestrial Encounters. And yeah, I think every single one of these cases is astounding. The cases I've picked today come from all over the world, including France, Italy, Norway, Poland, and Spain, as well as Australia, Canada, Argentina, and Brazil, and 2 cases from the United States, as it turns out both from California. These are cases that stretch over a pretty long period of time, 1961 to 1999, and do involve all different types of humanoids, ETs, such as greys and human-looking ETs, short little humanoids, the whole gamut, as well as the evidence we often see associated with UFO encounters. There's 4 main types of evidence, and those include landing traces, electromagnetic disturbances, physiological effects, and animal reactions. Each of these cases, I think, has some profound insight into the nature of ET contact, teaches us something about why ETs are here and how they behave, and they're also just darn fascinating. So let's get started. First case I'd like to talk about today, I call the humanoid in the fireball. This is a quite unusual case, unique in some ways. This occurred in the summer of 1961 in Anaheim, California. It is a single witness case relying solely on one person's anecdotal testimony, but it's a very close encounter. The witness is a good witness. I find him quite credible, and I think this case does have some interesting things to say about ET behavior. It was a summer evening in 1961, and Mike, who had just turned 7 years old, was camping with his buddy in the backyard of his home on Stony Brook Drive in the suburbs of Anaheim, California. Earlier, Mike's mother had decided that it might be fun if Mike and his friend spent the night in a pup tent, and Mike himself was excited by the prospect. It was around 10 p.m. Mike's friend was asleep when Mike looked up and saw this orange glow high up in the sky. Slowly, this glowing orange ball of light moved down in an arc, coming closer and closer until it was hovering right overhead at a very low altitude. And as Mike says in his own words, as it neared the electric pole next door, it went from a fiery orange ball to a more undulating, less intense orange ball. Its surface seemed to ripple. It became more translucent as it neared the power pole. Gauging its size above the power pole, I would estimate its size at about 8 to 10 feet in diameter, like 2 VW Bug automobiles put together. As it neared the power pole, it became more translucent. Soon, I was able to discern a humanoid-like being looking down at me. We looked at each other for less than a minute. Now, the next thing, Mike knew the object was gone, but he has no specific memory of how exactly it left, which definitely begs the question, is there more to this encounter than he can remember? But this is what he does remember, and he does recall telling his family and anyone else who would listen about this encounter right after it happened, and, of course, many times in the years that followed. It was a strange childhood event that he never forgot as he grew up. He later became a firefighter and a registered nurse, both jobs which he points out required careful observation and documentation of unusual events. He says he's skeptical by nature, but as he says, he knows what he saw when he was just 7 years old. As Mike says, while inside a tent in my backyard, I saw a glowing fireball descend and stop above a power pole. A being inside observed me. While I remain a skeptic who usually requires reproducible evidence, I can honestly say I saw that fireball with an inhabitant inside of it looking at me. A truly fascinating case, and I think it shows how profoundly an encounter like this, even a brief one, can affect a person for the rest of their lives. But to me, the most important takeaway of this case is it shows how ETs like to show themselves to people. I think this is clearly a case of what we would call a UFO display. ETs coming down and basically announcing their presence. I mean, when someone has that close of an encounter, it's undeniable. Certainly the ETs knew they were being observed because they're looking right down at the witness who's looking back up at them. An amazing case. And here's another. There's always another. I call this next one the Alien Under the Bridge. This took place in July of 1963 in Lesnica, Poland. This is a really interesting case for a number of reasons. It displays that often heard about Oz effect, where there's a weird, eerie silence pervading over the entire environment when people have an encounter. It is a multiple witness case. It's also got a really interesting aspect to it that we see in some cases, but yeah, this one's got some unique elements for sure. The investigator to this case is Arek Miazga. He's researched quite a few cases. He's quite prolific and very thorough. This is one of many astounding humanoid cases to take place in Poland. In this instance, the event took place off of Marzowiecka Road in Lesnica Park. This is in Lesnica, Poland, not far from Wrocław. And it is a multiple witness case, but the primary witness is Anna Sobczak. At the time of her encounter, she was a young child. It was one afternoon around July in 1963 when she and a group of children were playing in a field near their homes. This field contained a small stream which led into a small tunnel under Marzowiecka Road. To get to the field, the children had to cross this very small bridge. And on the day in question, Anna was standing in front of a group of children, and she was crouching at the entrance to this tunnel. Suddenly, all the sounds in the environment stopped, and a deathly silence fell over the area. Even the sound of the gurgling stream was gone. And at the same moment, they turned to look into this tunnel, and they all saw this short figure, only about 4 feet tall, standing inside this tunnel, and behind it was a backdrop of bright white light. Now normally you could see right through this tunnel to the bushes on the other side, but this light was so bright that that's all they could see. And at this moment a very strange feeling swept over Anna, she says, and she felt almost as if she was being drawn towards this being and this light. But at the same time, she said she was suddenly unable to move. This did allow her to get a very good look at the figure. She said it looked like he was dressed in a sort of loose-fitting, silvery metallic-looking diver's suit. There were no seams, no buttons of any kind. The suit itself seemed to emit an almost blinding light, which made it difficult to look at. The figure was very short, but did have a thick, bulky body, which she said was unlike a child. It also wore a bubble-shaped helmet on its head, the same color of the suit. She could see a corrugated-looking tube coming out of the top of the helmet, reaching around to the back of the creature. She was unable to see any facial features, but she did notice that its arms did not end in hands, but instead seemed to be rounded at the tip. This was her impression. Nevertheless, in one of its, quote, hands, it was holding a thin, long black stick. At this point, Anna and the other children were not feeling any fear. They were just curious. But that changed when the figure seemed to notice that it was being observed by them, at which point it suddenly raised one of its arms, which some of the children perceived as a threatening gesture. It was gesturing to them. Said almost Anna felt it was gesturing for her to come closer. But then the being started to turn and move, at which point they could hear a rustling noise coming from it, which sounded to them like crinkling aluminum foil, and as the being turned, it gestured again at the children. Anna noticed something else very strange, because as the being turned, she said it seemed to, quote, move in slow motion. Now I'll let Anna just give a brief description here of what she's experiencing. As she says, it had something like a stick in its hands and was making gestures with it, indicating to follow it. When it moved, you could hear a rustling sound like aluminum foil. It emanated a strange energy from itself, which drew us to it. It was hard for us to even back away. Time stopped. Only when he turned around could we make a move. Before that, we couldn't get back out of there. We were all very frightened and, screaming in panic, fled to the apartment building where I lived. I told my grandfather and grandmother about it, but they laughed at me, probably because I was a child. We never talked about the incident and never played in that place again. It was a very traumatic experience for me as a child. Now, Anna estimates this entire observation lasted only about 1 minute. But here's one final detail which might be connected. She felt it was important enough to mention, and it's that one day before the encounter, a man was driving his motorcycle right near this bridge and had a terrible accident, actually losing his life when his motorcycle hit a tree. A very cool case. It's always nice when the witness can provide an illustration of what they saw. It certainly helps bring the case to life. To me, one of the more interesting things about this case is not only the Oz effect, but the way that the humanoid was gesturing at the children. It's really quite odd. And also the motorcycle accident that occurred the day before. I wonder if there's a connection there. Also, it's impossible to say for sure. But it's an interesting aspect to that case, and certainly the witness felt it was important enough to mention. Now let's move to the next case, which I call the little ETs in the tiny UFO. I wanted to present this case because it's so unusual. It's a bit of an outlier, because in this case, the witness described a UFO that was really small, and the ETs inside of it were, of course, quite a bit smaller. But there are quite a few cases like this. And this also is a multiple witness case, and it does have physiological effects. This one took place on November 15, 1969 in Nancy, France. And I think you'll agree this is a really unusual and unique case. This very unusual case occurred at 19 Rue Saint-Georges. This is a central artery in the city of Nancy, France. A very crowded area, as you can see here. It was around 5 p.m. as the witness, she's anonymous, we know her only as Madame X, she's in her 50s, she approached the window of her apartment to feed birdseed to the pigeons. This was an activity she enjoyed and did it daily. Strangely, on this day, there were no pigeons. And she quickly saw why, because instead she saw this small, round, saucer-shaped craft. It was approaching at roof level towards her window. Now when she first saw it, it was partly hidden by one of the chimneys coming from the roof, so she leaned out the window to get a better look, and she watched this object move out from behind the chimney and approach even closer. And she was shocked to see that it was in fact a flying saucer. But not a normal one, this thing was tiny. She estimates it was about 60 centimeters wide, 2 feet, roughly the same size of a car tire. And at this point, the witness says she heard a, quote, voice in her head, encouraging her to observe the craft. So there was some sort of telepathic link going on here. She said the craft looked metallic, it had a small dome on top, and in fact it stopped right in front of her, literally only feet away. And inside it, she could see 2 small humanoids sitting side by side. She said that while they looked humanoid, they did have sort of an ape-like appearance. They weren't perfectly human. They did seem to be smiling at her, and she said inside of this craft were 2, quote, smiling guys, but very small. She says their heads were not much bigger than a person's fist. Now at one point the craft tilted, allowing her to see the underside, which had numerous lights similar to car headlights. Now, per the witness, she was not the only one watching this. There were 2 other people in the street looking up directly at this thing, including a police officer and a bank guard. Unfortunately, investigators were not able to interview these 2 witnesses, as one had passed away and the other they were not able to identify. But after just a brief moment of hovering right in front of her, this craft moved away, spiraling upwards in this weird maneuver, and quickly joined 2 other similar craft, all three of which then moved off in formation to the north. Now, going inside, the witness now smelled an odd, acidic, kind of chemical odor, and following this encounter, her hands and face became swollen, which she believes was due to the fact that these were the parts of her body that were most exposed to the headlights from the bottom side of this craft. Now, investigators were really puzzled by this case, particularly by the tiny size of the UFO and the occupants. And some of them who were skeptical speculated that perhaps the witness had actually banged her head against her window and had hallucinated the entire experience. The witness did admit to an interest in UFOs. However, per the witness, her window was actually open at the time, so this doesn't really make sense as an explanation. When I heard about how skeptics tried to debunk that case, that the lady actually just hit her head on the window and hallucinated the whole thing, that actually did make me laugh out loud. People will go to ridiculous lengths to explain away a case and kind of ignore the fact that there might be multiple witnesses or physiological effects and so forth. If the evidence doesn't fit into their worldview, they will simply discard it. So, let's move to the next case, which I call Visitors to Earth. This is a pretty brief account. It is a single witness case. There's not a whole lot to it. I think if the witness was more thoroughly interviewed, we could probably get some more details. But it's certainly a compelling case because this witness saw the UFO very close up. This one occurred in the summer of 1972 in Solvang, Norway. This is in the Oslo area. Ole Jani Brain is the main investigator to this case. He's the MUFON representative for Norway. It was about 7 p.m. as the witness, who is anonymous, was walking home when she noticed a classic silver metallic disc-shaped object hovering at a very low level above some nearby gardens. This disc had large floor-to-ceiling windows around the middle section, a flat bottom, and a dome on top. Your basic flying saucer. But several other people were in the area working in these gardens, but not one of them looked up. Seeing this strange object, which was very apparent, the witness did look up and watch as a silver ladder was lowered from the bottom center of the object all the way to the ground. No one came out, but looking inside this craft through the windows, she could see several figures moving around. They all looked human as far as she could tell. All were wearing silver coveralls and helmets. She says that they appeared to be quite busy with some sort of activity inside the craft. The object hovered only briefly, then rose up above the treetops and darted away at high speed. Now, Albert Rosales, who presented this case, comments, and I quote, "I wonder if the witness was the only one meant to see this object." So Albert Rosales raises an interesting point in that case. Was the witness the only one who was meant to see it? Because this was in a fairly crowded area. There should have been other witnesses, but nobody seemed to notice it. Perhaps some did, but like most people, just didn't report it. Impossible to say for sure, but we do know that there's quite a few cases where only one person is seeing a UFO, and there are other people who should be seeing it, and they're not. So that certainly has some profound implications, and is one of the many questions surrounding this subject that still have to be fully understood. Now let's move to the next case, which I call a UFO parked by the side of the road. Quite a few cases like this one. This is a really interesting one. This one occurred on September 6, 1973 in Penang, South Australia. This is actually not too far from the very famous Faye Knowles case in Australia, where Faye and her 3 sons were followed by a UFO which came down and actually lifted their car up into the sky. I did cover that in another episode, but a truly interesting case. I can't really tell you why without giving it away, so let's just get into it. This case first appeared in the book The Year of the Humanoids by David Webb, and of course occurred during this incredible, massive wave of humanoid encounters which were centered largely in the US, but also across the world. The location of this particular encounter was between Penang and Ivy Tanks in South Australia. Now, this case is super interesting. The woman, the main witness, was sleeping in the passenger seat of a semi-trailer as a friend drove along this lonely, remote, eerie highway in the middle of the vast desert area. It was late at night, and suddenly she was awakened by a, quote, voice. She apparently did not hear exactly what it said, but it woke her up, and almost immediately after awakening, she noticed a brightly lit, egg-shaped object to the left side of the road. She said it had an open door at one end and a large, squarish window on the side facing the highway. And she could also see two humanoids, two men, who looked like normal humans. One was outside the craft walking towards this open door, and the second one was sitting down inside the object right in front of this very large window. He appeared to be looking upward at something inside the craft. According to the witness, both were wearing shiny white-silver full-body jumpsuits. They did not appear to pay any attention to the witness or even notice them driving by. But as the truck passed, the bright lights surrounding this craft began to fade very quickly. The witness did immediately alert the driver, telling him to stop the vehicle, but by the time she got him to stop, the object had already faded to only a single dim white light. Now the report doesn't say what happened next here, but presumably that is the end of the sighting. Another pretty short account. Yes, not a whole lot of details to it. But there's a couple of interesting takeaways to it. One is, why the heck did this UFO park right next to the road where it could be seen? I think it wanted to be seen because why did the witness hear a voice in her head immediately prior to seeing this object? It woke her up, so this looks to me almost as if she was meant to see it or they were alerting her to their presence. It's also strange that the guy who was driving the car apparently did not see it. So I don't know, a very interesting case for sure. And now I move to another one. This one I call The Aliens on the Beach. This occurred in June of 1975 in Playa de Marin, Spain. And it is an unusual case for sure. This case took place on a small beach in Spain, again called Playa de Marin. This was one afternoon in June of 1975 as a young couple were walking along the beach. This is this tiny little beach, as you can see, when suddenly 3 disc-shaped objects appeared on the ocean horizon. Very quickly, the objects zoomed in a straight line towards them. They were making a low, rumbling sound, somewhat like the sound of an air leak, and were emitting a thick white streak behind them. Now they each stopped about 5 meters, 15 feet, right above the shoreline, where they slowly descended onto the beach, landing in a row about 650 meters away from the witnesses. This is just under 2,000 feet. These craft were classic flying saucers, about 10 meters or 30 feet in diameter, 4 meters high, 12 feet, and were resting on 3 or perhaps 4 landing legs. Now the disc in the center appeared to be all black, while the ones on either side of it, the top half was white and the bottom was red. All of them did have a central dome in the top center. Once they had landed, an opening appeared in each of these 3 discs, and little ladders or stairs came down, and immediately one being came out of each of these openings, climbed down these stairs, ladders, onto the beach. According to the witnesses, these figures looked identical, appeared to be about 1 meter tall, a little over, about 3 feet. All were wearing skin-tight uniforms with what looked like a wide belt around the waist. Now these beings walked in a normal fashion right up to each other. The witnesses were too far away to see any facial features. But the main witness, who, by the way, was a telecommunications worker, he says he did try to communicate telepathically with these ETs. He got no response, but instead he says he developed a migraine headache following this encounter. After these three figures briefly met up, all three returned back to their respective craft, all three of which immediately took off, again moving in a straight line. The witnesses did go to look at the beach area where these craft had landed, but couldn't see any traces in terms of footprints or landing marks. I just don't know quite what to think about some of these cases. Because here we have two people walking along the beach when UFOs appear, three of them come zooming towards them, come down, land, three ETs come out, and basically go right back in. Was this a display? Why were they landing? Why did they meet up like that? It's all quite odd. Don't know quite what to think of it. Certainly another interesting detail is that the witness did try to reach out telepathically and apparently could not communicate with them, but as a result got a headache. Very odd. Certainly an important addition to our understanding of what's going on here. Now we move to the next case, which I call the little man in the silver suit. This occurred in October of 1977 in the Chapada das Mesas area of Brazil. It's quite a rural area. And this one is a really interesting case for a number of reasons. It's a very close-up sighting with a landed UFO and an ET with physiological effects as well, as we will see. The researcher in this case is Edison Bonaventura Jr., and the witness is 78-year-old Jose Benedito Santos. It was one evening in October of 1977 that Jose and his friends had decided to go out hunting in the Chapada das Mesas area in Maranhão, Brazil. This is a sprawling nature area with a huge natural reserve, lots of wildlife, lots of rivers and waterfalls and such. But at some point during the night, again in October of 1977, Jose became separated from his friends. So he's walking around trying to find them, and this is when he noticed an orange light hovering among the trees. So he's looking at it when suddenly a bright, brilliant beam of light illuminates his surroundings, so bright he said it seemed like daytime. And at the same time, this hovering orange object is descending to the ground behind a group of trees just a short distance away. So now he's very curious. Jose approaches the light and sees that it is in fact an oval-shaped craft with a shiny red center. It was about 6 meters wide, 20 feet or so, when without warning, a 3-foot-tall humanoid appeared from behind the object. It was wearing a silver suit, a transparent fishbowl-type helmet. On top, you could see a little red-tipped antenna attached to it. You can see the drawing he made here. He did say that it looked like this silver suit had 3 golden stripes on it. But mostly, Jose was impressed by the being's large, dark, staring eyes. In fact, one of them looked right at him with a penetrating gaze. When this happened, Jose's curiosity turned to fear, especially when this figure began to suddenly approach. And as Jose says, when he came closer, I felt scared, but I calmed down and fainted. I woke up later with my colleagues around, asking what happened. So Jose told them what happened. They absolutely believed him. He was a very sincere witness. They knew him well. Following this encounter, Jose says he felt a general weakness in his body. He also did notice a small burn mark with tiny little puncture wounds in his neck. It did heal quickly over the next several days. I do feel for the witness in this case. It might have been quite a shock to be that close to an ET, so I can't really fault him for fainting dead away. It's a shame though, because it makes you wonder what would have happened if he was able to maintain consciousness. It's also interesting because of the physiological effects. Also the location. There are quite a few cases of ETs and UFOs hovering over nature reserves, which I think speaks to one of their missions, their goals on this planet, which is their concern over how we're treating the environment. This comes up again and again in first-hand contact cases. Could very well be that this was more than just a sighting, that he was taken on board, given that we don't really know how long he was there with the ETs, but certainly a fascinating case and pretty well verified as well. All right, next case. This one was professionally investigated. It is a fairly brief account again, but it is a multiple witness case with some outside corroboration. Very close-up encounter with humanoids and a UFO. I call this one the ETs on the balcony. This occurred in the summer of 1979 outside of Danville, California. This multiple witness case is virtually unknown, but it was published in the magazine The Missing Link. This case was reported by a lady by the name of Natalie. We do not know her last name. At the time of her encounter, she was 15 years old. And it was around 9 p.m. one summer evening, again in 1979. Natalie was in the car with her father, Yvonne, her mother, Noella, and her uncle, Raymond. They were driving from Victorville, California to Danville. And looking up at some point, they all noticed what at first appeared to be a very bright star. But it started moving. It seemed to be coming closer. And as it approached, they realized that it was, in fact, a flying saucer. They were just arriving in Danville. It approached them for a while, paced their car, but as they stopped off at a gas station, this craft moved so low in the sky that it looked to them like it was coming in for a landing. It appeared to be massive, they said, and was very close to the witnesses at this point. Close enough that they could see what looked like a, quote, balcony. This balcony went around the circumference of the craft, and standing on this balcony were several very tall, alien-looking beings. Each of them were wearing silver uniforms that looked like diving suits. It appeared to Natalie that these beings were at least 7 feet tall. The whole family watched the craft and humanoids for just a few brief moments, till suddenly, without warning, the tall figures walked back into the craft. The craft then emitted a high-pitched noise and zoomed upwards at very high speed. They continued the drive home, and talking about it the next day, they found out that there were other witnesses because some people approached them and asked if they had seen the object over Danville the previous evening. So yeah, apparently there were other witnesses. A lot of interesting aspects to that case. I like it because it is a multiple witness case. And again, they saw this pretty close up. It paced their car. They're pulling over to a gas station, and that's when it comes down. So again, it looks like there's intention in these cases where the ETs are showing themselves. I find it really fascinating. This is why I wanted to include this case, that the ETs came out on this little balcony on the outside of the UFOs. Which may sound unusual, but there's quite a few cases of this where ETs will actually step outside of their craft while it's still hovering in the air. The very famous Father Gill case in Papua New Guinea is a good example of this. So there's another case where ETs are standing out on a balcony. Really interesting, and I'm so glad that the witnesses did find other witnesses who saw UFO activity in that area at that time. But apparently they're the only ones who saw the humanoids. Now we move to the next case, which I call Conversation with an Extraterrestrial. This is a really extensive case, quite an important case in Argentina, fairly well known. You may have heard of it. This occurred on August 24, 1985 in the Ituzaingó area of Argentina. Of all the cases in this compilation, this one I think is definitely one of the most extensive and important and interesting because the witnesses got a whole lot of information and, as the title implies, did have a conversation with extraterrestrials. This case took place on Route 12. In between Posadas and Corrientes. The witnesses are anonymous. We'll call them Jose, who is age 41, and his wife Maria, age 36. They're both doctors. And again, driving along Route 12, they were driving pretty slowly because there were animals occasionally crossing the road. This was late at night, after midnight. and they had just passed the exit at Ituzaingó in Argentina. Now ahead of them, suddenly on the road, without warning, they saw unusual looking, very colorful pink and yellow lights, almost pastel looking. Now they did think for a moment this might be a truck, but these lights didn't look like a truck. Jose slowed down even more, and as they got closer, they could see that these lights were right on the highway, so bright that Jose had to stop. His wife wanted him to continue, but he was unable to see past these bright lights, couldn't really see the road, they were so bright, could only drive very slowly, so he's inching forward. It was at this point he noticed three men, three humanoid figures on the side of the road approaching their car. And I'll just quote Jose directly, as he says, "I cannot believe what happened to us. It is extraordinary. We saw three men on the side of the road, and further up there was a strong light. As my wife had recently been assaulted, she became nervous, and when one of the men signaled me to stop, she became very ill. I approached the shoulder where the tall man, dressed in a kind of tight-fitting onesie, signaled me by raising his hand. He approached the driver's side and, speaking calmly and correctly, said to me, 'Don't be afraid. We are not going to hurt you. We just want to get to know you. We are from another planet. We come from a place where there are seasons, winds, rain, cold, heat, just like you. We are only different in some aspects. We travel in those devices you call UFOs. Don't be afraid.'" Now hearing this, Maria had an almost complete nervous breakdown. She was screaming to her husband, Jose, "Start the car. Let's get out of here." Jose tried, but at this point the engine had no power. So he's looking at these guys by the side of the road. He says their jumpsuits were dark in color, except for a light strip where the shoulders were. Their hair was of medium length, not long or short. Their faces were very handsome. He said that they had large, pleasant eyes, and they spoke verbally, out loud, in fluent Argentinian Spanish. The strange man then told them that they came from a planet called Mate. They said it was very similar to Earth, only slightly larger. He then looked at Maria, the ET did, and said, "Don't be afraid. We are not going to hurt you. We are leaving, as we do not want to cause you any problems. Wait for the ship to rise and then start the car engine." Now before the man left, he did say some more words. He said that there were many people in the world who already knew of their existence, but they don't speak out, and that they, the ETs, do not know why. He tried again to calm down Maria, asked her to tell everyone that they are good. He was smiling as he spoke. Then he made a very unusual request of Jose, and I'll just let Jose say what he experienced. As Jose says in his own words, "He asked us for something to take home as a souvenir, and I gave him what I found in the glove compartment: a bottle of perfume, some toothpaste, a packet of biscuits, and one note, a money note." And he said, explaining in each case what we were using them for. The man thanked me and shook my hand in farewell. I hardly felt any temperature. It was normal. They asked me to say that they are good. They don't want to hurt us. They just want to get to know us. We have come to meet you. Tell everyone not to be afraid. Then he said goodbye, turned around and went back to where two other men similar to him were waiting for him, about 30 meters away. He joined them and they disappeared from sight. A few minutes later, which seemed like an eternity, we saw a strange and powerful light rise from the side of the road, disappearing rapidly into the starry night. We were stupefied, open-mouthed, and only then was I able to start the engine of the car. So the couple immediately drove to the home of Norma Massa. She's a well-known journalist who lived not far away. They knew her address. They knocked on her door at about 2:30 a.m., telling her that they had suffered an accident and needed help. She reluctantly let them in, asked them what happened. They refused at first to divulge any details, but were finally persuaded only on the condition of absolute anonymity. And speaking to Norma, Jose said, and I quote, "We went here, remembering that you had written many articles that I read. I knew that you lived here, and that is why we dared to come to your house, because my wife was really very ill. But when we realized that we had been in front of a being from space, it was very difficult for us to believe. But the facts were as I told them to you, without removing or adding any details. Let everyone think what they want. I only know that something extraordinary happened to us, and I regret not having asked this being from space more questions. It was really an unforgettable, incredible experience. Personally, after what happened to me, I am sure that I spoke with an alien being who came to fulfill a mission of rapprochement with human beings." So arriving in Norma's house, they gave Maria a tranquilizer. She fell asleep, and Norma decided, let's go investigate. As Norma says, "We left the lady to rest and went with her husband to the meeting place, where we saw nothing, and where we returned yesterday morning without finding any trace." With the new day, and after having maintained a long conversation which allowed us to know the seriousness of both, the couple left back to Corrientes capital. So Norma, again a journalist, ended up writing an article about the couple's experience. And in this article she quotes Jose extensively. And this is an important quote. As Jose says, "I am moved to make this statement by one circumstance alone. And that is that man asked me to tell everyone who wants to know us, and not to be afraid, that they are good beings. I do this because, if all this contributes to clarifying the whole mystery of extraterrestrial beings, we will have contributed to sharing with humanity that we are part of. If all of this turns out to be fantasy invented by Americans or Russians who own highly sophisticated and fast spaceships, we will have wasted our time. But I personally am sure that I spoke with a being from another world, a kind being, sweet at times, concerned about us, who only wanted perhaps to fulfill a mission of getting closer to Earth and to humanity. And although I must admit that I was very scared, it will be one of the most beautiful and fascinating memories that I have ever experienced. And I hope it happens to me again, because then I will get out of the car, exchange opinions, and ask what I did not do now, ask as a result of the strong impression I had." So again, this incident took place very near to Wakrita Dam, one of the largest dams in the world actually. After publication of the article, there was some interesting corroboration because Jose Cabrera, the General Secretary of the large hydroelectric works, said that at 1 a.m. on that morning, while working at this dam, he and several others saw a glowing object which moved around in the sky and hovered in the area. Later, another witness came forward, a farmer who said he was drawn outside by his animals acting up, and he saw a, quote, luminous object. So he saw UFOs on more than one occasion. This was just 2 days before Jose's and Maria's encounter. And as it turns out, this area seems to be a UFO magnet, as there are many sightings that have taken place in this area. And in fact, some people, as you can see, have even gotten photographs and moving films of them. Clearly an important case where the witnesses got a whole lot of information about why the ETs are here. And it's typical of so many cases we see with a UFO stopping a car along a highway late at night. Seems a bit opportunistic. ET sees someone driving along and like, hey, let's say hi to these folks. It looks like that's what's happening in this case. Though again, they may have been there because of this very large hydroelectric dam. We know ETs are in fact attracted to these kinds of locations. But it's certainly a fascinating case with the ETs imparting so much information and basically just wanting to announce their presence and let people know that they have nothing to fear from them, that they're not here to take over, and are just contacting people all over the world to basically announce their presence. A cool case. Such a shame the wife was so frightened. Now let's move to the next case, which also has some interesting insights into the nature of UFOs and ETs. I call this one the alien from the black sphere. This one took place in October of 1989 in San Piero a Sieve in Italy. And this is an interesting case because it actually involves a series of events, landing traces, physiological effects, animal reactions, quite a bit of evidence to this one, also multiple witness case, and as we'll see, a very unusual series of events. This case comes from the very prolific and respected researcher Moreno Tambellini of CUN, the Centro Ufologico Nazionale UFO Group. The witnesses are two elderly farmers from San Piero a Sieve. This is near the rural Mugello area of Florence, Italy. It was throughout 1988 and 1989 that they began to see this strange figure dressed in a black jumpsuit actually floating, levitating around their property. In fact, they called him the fish man because he moved easily through the air just like a fish in water. And when he would appear, he always arrived in a large, dark, silver sphere. This craft sometimes landed and damaged their crops. And when this object would appear, it would move around in near silence, making only a soft whisper, quote, like a breath. Now the figure that came out of this had long black hair and reddish eyes, though the farmers said this may have been a helmet with a visor. But at first, thinking the being was having trouble with its craft, which was quite low, the couple tried to approach to help, and each time the figure would shout at them, apparently verbally, "Don't come close, because you'll burn." So after no less than 4 events like this, the couple became increasingly frustrated and afraid, because some of their crops were being destroyed. Then, one morning, around 11 a.m., this large black sphere appeared again, once again landing and crushing and destroying their crops. The same dark-suited figure emerged and began flying around. Their dog started going crazy, barking at the strange creature, and now tired of the constant intrusions and angry at the destruction of his food crops, the husband finally decided he'd had enough. He grabbed a pitchfork and rushed towards this flying being in an attempt to chase it away. To his shock, the being sent out a beam of light from its eyes or helmet area, which instantly paralyzed the farmer. Now, thinking that her husband's life was in danger, his wife screamed for her husband to run away, but he couldn't. And at that moment, the being returned inside the sphere, which remained hovering a few meters above the ground for a short time, and then after a few minutes, it made a loud noise, rose upwards, and departed away in a flash. Now, I can't fault the witness for running towards this ET with a pitchfork. As we can see, probably not a good idea. What's really interesting to me about this case is that the ET warned him over and over again, don't get too close, you could get burned. And when the witness did not heed those instructions, that's when he was struck by a beam of light. So it doesn't appear that this was a hostile encounter in any way. Often I think it's people's fear of what's happening that causes them to label an experience as negative, which is understandable. If you're in abject terror, it's not a pleasant experience. But again, no real good evidence that ETs are here to hurt, harm, take over, cause people problems. I think if you take a real close, hard, objective look at ET contact, especially the onboard experiences, you get a much clearer picture of what's going on here. So let's move to the next case. This one is so profound. This one did get a lot of publicity. You may have heard of it. It's a really unusual case. I don't know of any quite like it. There's a few, but not quite like this one. A multiple witness case, some interesting evidence as well. I call this one A Night in a Tree with Aliens. This occurred on May 17, 1997 in the La Rumarosa area of Mexico. And what an unusual case this is. This case was initially investigated in part by Jaime Maussan, but Many other investigators have looked into it, and it's become a very well-known event in Mexican ufology. It involves three young men, Raul Fabrizio Garcia, Salvador Villanueva, and Lamoni Gonzalez. They're all teenagers, and they had joined a hiking expedition with a group of other young men planning on camping in the wilderness of the La Rumorosa area. This is outside of Tecate in Baja California in Mexico. Now again, May 17, 1977, they were hiking for quite some time, and they were about 6 hours into the hike when it was apparent that their guide had become disoriented and lost. So they continued walking for another 2 hours without any real idea of where they were going, when Fabrizio made an important decision. He decided that he, his two friends Salvador and Lamoni, were going to separate from the group in hopes of finding water and figuring out where the heck they were. Now this area was quite dry and arid, and they could see a much greener mountain ahead of them, so they headed in that direction. They did have a compass, but it wasn't working. They walked deep into the night when it became clear to them that they were going to have to stop and rest for the evening. Now they had seen rattlesnakes and other wildlife, so they didn't want to sleep on the ground. They found a very large oak tree with big thick branches, and they decided to climb up there, secure themselves to the branches with their belts, and spend the night up there safe from any predators or wild animals. This is the tree right here that they actually climbed. The men were trying to fall asleep when Fabrizio looked up and saw some star-like lights moving around, and he shouted out to the others, "Look, the stars are moving." The other boys looked up and saw these objects. After a while they seemed to move off, and they stopped paying attention until they saw more lights. These were lower, and they thought for a moment that perhaps the other group of boys were approaching with flashlights and coming to rescue them. So they started shouting out to them, announcing their location. But, as Salvador says, "They came closer to us a little more. I've never seen anything like this." So he told his friends, "You better stop yelling because you don't know what you're seeing." And it was at this point that the boys now saw a UFO, a classic saucer, as they says, a silvery shape, a discoidal shape. It was iridescent and glowing. It had a large dome on top, portholes. A weird, strange light mist started to come down around the area. At one point, this object sent down a brilliant beam of light on the tree, and then it began to release more than a dozen glowing orb-like objects, which started darting around them, moving around the tree, moving in geometric formations. This went on for a little while, and then the orbs returned back into the craft. Now there was no noise at any time coming from the craft or the orbs. But the next thing these boys knew, there were several, quote, small luminous beings with big heads, black eyes. They were descending down the hill towards them. And as they did this, some of them were looking down at the ground and picking things up. Others were crouching down. The boys watched, paralyzed with fear, as the beings approached the base of the tree. They knew that these were physical beings as they could hear their footsteps. They estimate these beings were about 1 meter, 3 feet tall, with skinny bodies, long, spindly limbs. The most noticeable thing was their eyes. They didn't see any nose. So these were apparently typical grays, although they were glowing. And as Lamoni says to his friend, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Fabrizio was stunned, silent at first, and finally told his friend to keep quiet, quote, "so they don't know we're here." There were 3 or 4 groups of them. These little orbs of light reappeared, continued to circle the area, while these little glowing beings walked back and forth beneath the tree. The boys really had no choice but to keep quiet and wait to see what happened. And at this point, these little beings did not appear to be aware of the boys in the trees. But one of the boys dropped his pocket knife, and immediately there was a reaction. These beings became camouflaged in a weird way, looking almost transparent. They could still see their outlines, And at this point, some of them seemed to actually climb the tree. They could tell because they were leaving behind this weird fluorescence wherever they moved, little fluorescent footprints. Salvador says that at one point one of them actually came right up to him and touched him on the chest, peered under his hat, trying to look at his face. And this went on for a long time. I mean, these beings remained for a period of hours until about 5 a.m. when it began to get light. And at this point, these beings disappeared one by one in a flash of light. So, finally climbing down from the tree in the morning light, the boys did notice two unusual things. There was a series of stones set up in the formation of a triangle. They did not see this the evening before. It's possible it was there, but they don't think so. But they also found several small three-toed footprints. So this was quite an amazing experience for them, and soon they did go public with their story, and it went viral. They eventually appeared on radio and television shows. It appeared in newspaper articles. Turned out there were other witnesses because many people in the area came forth to see that they had seen UFOs in this area. And in fact, many said that they had seen glowing beings in this area as well. It had quite a reputation going way, way back, really many, many years, to the original native inhabitants who had a mythology about beings in this area. So this area quickly began to gain a reputation as a UFO hotspot, and people started to travel there specifically to see UFOs. And they were successful. Some did see some amazing things. In fact, a group of journalists went there and saw glowing beings, which really put a lot of people's attention on this area. Eventually, Fabrizio did write a full-length, very well-received Spanish-language book on their experience, which he titled El Noche en el Árbol, or The Night in the Tree. All three witnesses say that their lives were changed forever by the experience. Fabrizio did go under hypnosis to recall more details. Couldn't really recall much, but he suspects that they might have been taken on board. He would later have further encounters. He does feel that this experience not only improved his health physically, but provided a whole new outlook on life and provided him with a spiritual awakening. He does say that when he was a little boy, he used to see a, quote, woman in white, who he assumed was a ghost. But following this encounter, he now wonders if those early childhood experiences might have been ET related. I mean, all I can say to that case is, wow. I actually spoke with researcher Albert Rosales about it, and he is equally impressed with it. And as you can see, it not only had a profound effect on the witnesses, but on all the people in the area who live around this encounter. And it continues to make waves. I mean, the gentleman wrote an entire full-length book about their experience. It's so unusual for an encounter to last that long, too. And like the witness says, it wouldn't surprise me if there was more to it and perhaps they were taken on board, but we don't have any direct evidence of that. So it appears to be a close encounter of the third kind. So I don't know. It's really an odd case, but certainly an important one. Now let's move to the last case of this compilation. This one's super fascinating. It is a single witness case without any real evidence to it, though it does have some sort of interesting corroborative evidence, which is peripherally related, I guess. I call this one the ET who walked on water. That alone, I think, makes this case really unusual. This one occurred in May of 1999 in Corner Brook. This is in Newfoundland, Canada. And a very close-up encounter that seemed quite fortuitous, with some interesting premonitions involved with it. So yeah, some real interesting and unusual aspects to this case, especially what the ET was doing. Ryan Vike is the main researcher in this case. He's from Canada. He's investigated a whole lot of encounters, and he received a written report from this witness who requested total anonymity. This case took place in a very rural area immediately outside of the town of Corner Brook in Newfoundland, Canada, where incidentally the witness says he's had a few odd experiences. But this main one occurred one afternoon in May of 1999 when he was taking a walk. He was going up this long, low mountain area when a feeling of, quote, uneasiness came over him. In fact, it was so strong it prompted him to cut his walk short. And instead of walking back the way he came, for some odd reason, he took a shortcut, which required him to slog his way through this marshy area towards where he had parked his car. He was about 5 minutes away from his car when another strange impulse overcame him. This feeling of uneasiness was now gone, but for some reason he decided to make a quick stop at a nearby pond known as 3 Mile Dam. He had often sat here and enjoyed the nature, watching baby beavers and their parents frolicking in this lake. And I'll just quote the witness directly. As he says, "I have to preface this with the fact that I have never had any experiences like this before or since. I don't hallucinate. I'm not medicated. I don't drink or do drugs. What I saw was so shocking it affected everything in my life. I walked up the path, and as I was nearing the pond, something caught my attention. I saw a tall white humanoid figure hovering just over the surface of the water. This thing was about 20 meters in front of me and seemed to be in a trance-like state, just floating in the air. It sounds crazy, but it was solid and big, and dressed in a white suit from head to toe, and had what looked like a gray shield over where its eyes would be. A pure white suit with a dark shield. I was terrified. I was so scared that I was paralyzed. And the moment I could move, I turned slowly and started to walk along the side of the pond. By this time the being had sort of awakened out of this trance. It was suspended, not moving, until it noticed me, and we acknowledged each other. And without so much as a splash of water, it was on the other side of the pond opposite to me. It glided silently across the pond's surface very fast, and I clearly heard twigs and branches breaking as it moved quickly through the woods. I have never run so fast in my life. I ran back to the car and drove back to Corner Brook, and I wasn't sure who to tell. Weird stuff. So we did finally find Brian Vike and reported his encounter. And regarding his previous weird experiences that he had in this area, he said that in 1994, he and his mom were walking in this same location when suddenly his dog ran off to bark at something. So they followed the dog and they came upon a group of small trees, spruce, birch, and willow trees, which had been mysteriously bent at a 90-degree angle and appeared to be woven around each other and swirled in a counterclockwise direction at about waist height. These were not big trees. They were about 2 to 10 inches in diameter. But, as the witness says, it struck us as extremely odd in that none of the trees were snapped. Now, there is a water treatment plant and a dam next to this area, again, which is known to attract ETs. So perhaps that was the draw here in this case. How crazy is that? This humanoid figure just floating inches above the water. Looked to the witness almost like it was walking on water. But no, it was apparently levitating. While he didn't see a UFO, given that this figure was wearing this skin-tight jumpsuit, covered its entire body, a helmet with a visor, doesn't sound like a ghostly figure. And also super interesting is that there's a little hydroelectric plant in this area. Again, as we saw in a previous case, this is something that ETs do seem to be attracted to, studying or checking out for one reason or another. Just an overall interesting case, and especially the event before it, where the witness was walking with his mother and saw what looked like a little UFO landing nest, for lack of a better word, landing traces. Of course, he can't connect it directly to this encounter, but I wonder about it because, again, this area with the hydroelectric plant, that makes sense. All right, that's it for today, you guys. 12 cases coming from all over the world, all different types of humanoids, compelling evidence of various types, multiple witnesses. It's funny, I still get comments from some of you folks out there like, you're skeptical. And I get it. I came into this field as a skeptic, but the fact is, I've now covered literally thousands of humanoid cases on this channel alone. And there's still a lot more where these came from. So if you want to discard one case, go right ahead. I'll bring another to your attention. If you want to discard that one, go ahead. I will bring another. I'm going to keep bringing them until people recognize that this is happening. This is real. There is evidence to support it. It is going on. It's an important subject. I think it has the potential to change the way we all think about ourselves, each other, and our place in the universe. That's why I'm doing these videos. So thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. I love you all very much. Hope you have a great weekend. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday. Bye.